What is it truly like? I mean, really, like, to see the color red, not just, processing light waves, but that actual experience, that vivid crimson.
Yeah, or feeling a specific pain, that unique sort of twinge or maybe a deep ache.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That incredibly personal, subjective quality. Philosophers call it phenomenal consciousness, right?
That's the term. It often feels like the ultimate mystery, like this private inner world that nobody else can truly fully access.
It feels like the very essence of experience itself.
It really does. Think about the sound of a trumpet blast, that specific timbre, or seeing a sunset with all those pinks and oranges mixing together. And the huge challenge, the core question in philosophy of mind is exactly that. How do these rich, subjective feelings emerge from? Well, from what science tells us, it's basically just information processing in our brains.
It seems like such a massive leap, a gulf almost.
It does.
And that leap, that really profound question, is exactly what we're diving into today. We're taking a deep dive into Peter Carruthers' book, Phenomenal Consciousness, a Naturalistic Theory. Now, his claim is pretty bold.
Very bold. He argues that this so-called hard problem of consciousness, the thing so many people think is just fundamentally beyond explanation, maybe isn't so hard after all.
So our mission today is to unpack his naturalistic approach. We want to explore how he deals with some, really common objections, things we probably all feel intuitively, and ultimately try to understand what it really means for consciousness to be explained scientifically, maybe even reductively.
Yeah, and I think you'll find it challenges some deeply held ideas about your own mind. Hopefully, in a good way, an eliminating way.
Carruthers himself even mentions that there's this pull towards mystery, doesn't he? And that trying to debunk it can sometimes face resistance.
He does. But his work is this really rigorous defense of the idea that what seems inherently mysterious can actually be understood within a naturalistic, scientific framework.
Okay, so let's set the stage a bit. Before we get into Carruthers' specific arguments, when we say consciousness, what exactly are we nailing down here? Because that word gets thrown around a lot.
It's true, it's a very broad term. Carruthers is quite careful, though. He makes some important distinctions. The fundamental thing he's trying to explain is how those unique subjective qualities, that what it's like aspect, how they arise from information processing.
Right, the what it's like part, that specific subjective experience, that's phenomenal consciousness. And it's often described with examples, isn't it? Because it feels so intrinsic, like something we just recognize. You know what it's like to taste chocolate or feel warmth. It's the feeling itself.
Precisely. And that's really key to distinguish from what's often called access consciousness.
Okay, access consciousness, what's that?
That's more about mental states being available, available for us to use in reasoning or planning or maybe reporting verbally. That's what he'd call first-order access. Or, slightly different, a state could be available for you to actually think about it. That's higher-order access.
Ah, okay. So information being usable versus the raw experience.
Kind of. And in us humans, they often go together, right?
Yeah.
But conceptually, they're distinct things. You could, in theory, have information available without that subjective what it's like feeling.
Got it. And we're focusing on active mental events happening now, not just stuff stored away in memory, like current states versus standing states.
That's right. The focus is squarely on those active, ongoing experiences, not, say, your belief that Paris is the capital of France, which just sits there until you access it.
Okay, so this sets up a big divide in the philosophy of mind, doesn't it? Mysterianism versus naturalism.
Exactly. Can phenomenal consciousness be reductively explained, understood in terms of lower-level physical stuff? Or functional roles? That's naturalism. Or is it just fundamentally mysterious, maybe even beyond what science can ever grasp? That's Mysterianism.
And Carruthers is firmly in the naturalist camp. He thinks, yes, we can explain it.
Absolutely. That's the whole project of the book.
All right, terms defined. Let's rewind a bit then and look at one of the first big attempts to explain this phenomenal consciousness stuff. First-order representationalism, or F4R theory. What was the basic idea there? It sounds kind of intuitive.
It does have an initial appeal. 4R theory basically says that phenomenal consciousness, that what it's like, comes directly from the properties of the first-order mental states themselves. So when you see a red apple, your conscious experience of redness is just a property of that very perceptual state that's representing the redness of the apple.
Okay, so the experience is the representation.
Pretty much. And the appeal is, well, it seems to give consciousness a clear job, right? It links it directly to how we represent the world, how we access information about our surroundings and our bodies. Consciousness is just our direct line to reality in this view.
Yeah, that feels right somehow. Like consciousness is just my window onto the world, but it hits some snags, doesn't it? Especially this idea of, well, non-conscious experience. That sounds like a contradiction.
That sounds strange at first.
Can you really have an experience you're not conscious of? Like that example of the absent-minded driver who steps over a tree root on the path, but has zero memory of it, no conscious awareness of doing it?
That's exactly the kind of common sense challenge it runs into.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is that science backs this up pretty strongly. Take people with blind sight.
Ah, yes, I've heard of this. Damage to the visual cortex, V1.
Right. They genuinely report being blind in parts of their visual field. They're absolutely convinced they see nothing there.
Mm.
But if you ask them to guess, say, where a light flashed or which way a line is tilted in that blind field, they perform way, way better than chance.
Wow, so they're not just guessing randomly.
Not at all. It strongly suggests their brain is processing that visual information, even though they have no conscious experience of seeing it. It's non-conscious perception.
Okay, that's wild. See, without knowing you're seeing. Their brain knows, but they don't.
Exactly. And Milner and Goodale's two systems hypothesis offers a framework for this. They suggest we have, broadly, two visual systems. There's a what-where system, mainly in the temporal lobe. That seems to be the conscious one, used for recognizing objects, planning actions based on what you see.
Okay, the conscious recognition part.
And then there's a separate how-to system, more in the parietal lobe. This system seems to be largely non-conscious and is used for guiding actions in real time, like adjusting your grip to pick up an object precisely.
The unconscious autopilot for movement?
Something like that. Think about the Miller-Lyer illusion, those lines with the arrows at the ends.
Yeah, one looks longer even though they're the same.
Right. Your conscious perception is totally fooled. You see one as longer. But if you reach out to grasp the lines, your fingers adjust perfectly to the actual length.
No way.
Yes. Your how-to action system isn't fooled by the illusion, even though your conscious what-where system is completely taken in.
Huh. So my hand knows the truth even when my eyes are lying to me, consciously. That's almost creepy, like there's someone else driving in there.
It's definitely counterintuitive. But it leads to this big problem for F4 theory. Carruthers calls it a trilemma.
Okay, lay it on me.
Well, if conscious perceptions, like seeing the Miller-Lyer line, and non-conscious perceptions, like the information guiding your hand, can have the exact same content representing the same line length, for instance. And they can even serve similar functions, like guiding some kind of behavior.
Right.
Then what is it exactly that makes the first one phenomenally conscious, gives it that what-it's-like feeling, and the second one not?
Where does the feeling, the subjectivity, actually come from if the information and the function can be the same?
That's the explanatory gap that F4 theory really struggles to bridge.
Okay.
Why should just being available for one kind of decision-making suddenly grant this subjective field, this what-it-is likeness?
Okay, I see the problem. It just doesn't seem to account for the special feel part.
It struggles mightily. And this, Carruthers argues, is where we need a different kind of theory.
Which brings us to the higher order theories. HOR theories.
That's right.
So the idea here is that the what it's like part doesn't come from the first order state itself, the seeing red part, but from a higher order state that somehow represents or targets that first order state.
Exactly. It shifts the focus. It's not just about what you perceive, but about how the system relates to that perception, how it's represented again at higher level.
Okay, so it's like a meta representation.
In a sense, yes.
Yeah.
And Carruthers champions a specific version, dispositionalist, higher order thought theory. Hawthorne theory for short, but the dispositionalist part is crucial.
Right, dispositionalist. So it's not saying we're constantly actively thinking, I am now seeing red, or I am feeling this specific pain, because that sounds exhausting and just not how it feels.
That would be cognitively overwhelming and just doesn't ring true. The dispositionalist idea is different. Carruthers suggests that our first-order experiences, the outputs of our perceptual systems, say, are held in a kind of special short-term buffer. He calls it the C-box for conscious.
Okay, a temporary holding area.
And the critical thing is that the states held in this C-box are disposed to cause higher-order thoughts about themselves, if needed. They have the potential to trigger a thought like, I am seeing red, even if they don't always do so.
So it's the availability to be thought about rather than the act of thinking itself, like potential energy versus kinetic energy.
That's a good way to put it. It's about the functional potential. Carruthers uses an analogy like the motion of a piston in an engine.
Ah, yeah, I remember reading that.
The motion is understood as being of a piston, not because the motion itself has some intrinsic pistonness, but because of its functional role. its relationship to the crankshaft, the cylinder, the whole system. Its nature is defined by its place and disposition within the system.
So the phenomenal quality of an experience isn't intrinsic to the raw data, but emerges from its functional role, specifically its availability to these higher-order thoughts.
That's the core claim. And notice how this solves the problem that tripped up F4 theory.
How so? The blind sight problem.
Yeah, those non-conscious states, like the visual information guiding the hand in blind sight, or maybe processing happening in what Carruthers calls the N box for non-conscious, those states are not held in the C box. They are not available to generate these kinds of higher-order thoughts about themselves. They lack that specific dispositional property.
And therefore, no phenomenal consciousness.
Exactly. Only the contents of the C box, because they're available to the system that generates higher-order thoughts, acquire that phenomenal feel. The disposition is the difference maker.
Okay, that's a pretty elegant solution, functionally speaking. But it leads to some big questions about what we usually think consciousness is like. Like qualia.
Ah, yes.
Yes.
The infamous qualia.
Those supposedly unique, intrinsic, private, ineffable qualities of experience. The redness of red, the painfulness of pain. If this high-T theory is right, what happens to them? Carruthers argues they don't really exist as intrinsic properties, right? Qualia or realism.
He does. He argues there are no such intrinsic, ineffable properties.
But then, why does it feel so strongly like there are? Why does my experience of red seem so private, so specific, so red in a way that feels impossible to fully describe?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Carruthers' explanation is quite clever. He argues that the HOR theory itself can explain why we are tempted to believe in these intrinsic properties. He talks about our recognitional concepts of experience. These are the concepts we deploy when we recognize, that's the feeling of pain, or, yep, that's red again.
Okay, like pattern recognition for feelings.
Sort of. And he suggests that while these concepts were actually embedded in a whole network of other concepts and theories, our folk psychology, we can sort of mentally carve them out. We treat them as if they were purely recognitional, purely about the raw feel, detached from any theory or relation.
So we create an illusion of purity. We mentally isolate the feeling part.
That's the idea. This conceptual carving out creates the powerful illusion that qualia are intrinsic, private, and ineffable, even though, according to the theory, they're not.
That is a very philosophical judo move, using the theory to explain away the intuition that seems to contradict it.
It is. It reframes the mystery. The mystery isn't a feature of the world, but a feature of how our concepts work, or how we sometimes misuse them.
And this ties into how he handles classic thought experiments, like the Mary argument.
Definitely. The knowledge argument. Mary, the brilliant neuroscientist stuck in the black and white room, knows all the physical facts about color vision. Then she steps out and sees red for the first time.
The argument being, she learned something new. Ergo, something new. The experience of red must be non-physical.
Right. Carruthers agrees Mary learned something new. But crucially, he argues she doesn't learn any new propositional fact about the world that wasn't already captured by her complete physical knowledge.
So what does she learn then?
She gains new concepts and new abilities. She acquires a new recognitional concept for red. She can now identify it directly. And she gains practical knowledge or know-how. The ability to remember red, imagine red, recognize red when she sees it again.
So it's like learning how to ride a bike versus reading the physics of bike riding. She gains know-how, not know that.
Exactly. She gains a new way of accessing or thinking about a property, redness, whose physical nature she already fully understood.
Yeah.
It's a difference in cognitive access and abilities, not a difference in the fundamental facts of the world.
Okay, so the intuition that she learned a new fact is misleading. It's a new skill or concept.
That's his argument. And he stresses that just because we can conceive of things being different, like Mary, and knowing all physical facts, but lacking the experience, doesn't mean it's genuinely metaphysically possible. Conceivability doesn't equal possibility.
Like the philosophical zombies idea. Creatures physically identical to us, behaving identically, but with no inner experience, no lights on inside.
Or inverted qualia, someone who sees green where we see red, but calls it red and functions identically. Carruthers argues that while we can perhaps conceive of these scenarios in the abstract, it doesn't show they are actually possible in our world. Phenomenal consciousness, he argues, if it's a natural property grounded in these high-tie mechanisms, is thickly individuated.
Thickly individuated, meaning?
Meaning it's tightly bound to the specific underlying physical and functional facts that realize it in our world. You can't just conceptually peel it away or swap it around like you could with some abstract property. Our Our ability to conceive of zombies might just reflect the limitations or quirks of our concepts, not the metaphysical reality.
Okay, this is all building a coherent picture, but it has some pretty striking implications, particularly for non-human animals and maybe even young children.
Ah, yes. This is often seen as a major hurdle for hype theories.
If phenomenal consciousness requires these higher-order thoughts, and those thoughts maybe depend on having a theory of mind, the ability to think about mental states,
Which seems to develop in humans around age 3 or 4, and might be limited or different in many animals.
then the theory seems to imply that many animals, infants, maybe some individuals with autism who have different theory of mind capacities, might lack phenomenal consciousness. That feels uncomfortable, maybe even morally problematic for some.
It's definitely the implication that often causes the most pushback. But Carruthers faces it directly. He has two main lines of response. First, he questions the strength of our evidence for animal consciousness in the first place. He suggests our strong intuition that, say, a dog or chimpanzee has rich subjective experiences might largely be a result of imaginative identification. We project our own kind of consciousness onto them based on their behavior. We might lack objective grounds for attributing phenomenal consciousness, specifically.
That's a tough line. Anthropomorphism in reverse, almost. What's the second point?
The second point is crucial for the moral dimension. He argues forcefully that moral status, particularly concerning suffering, should not depend on phenomenal consciousness. Instead, should depend on things like having first-order desires, goals, preferences, and the capacity for those to be frustrated. An animal can clearly want food, avoid pain, seek comfort. These are real states that matter morally whether or not they have a higher-order, phenomenally conscious experience of those wants and pains in the way we do.
So even if a dog doesn't have the what it's like experience of pain exactly like ours, its avoidance of injury, its yelping, its desire not to be harmed, those first-order states are what ground our moral obligation not to cause it pain.
Precisely. It separates the metaphysical question, what is phenomenal consciousness, from the ethical one, what beings deserve moral consideration. So the theory doesn't, in his view, put animals beyond the moral pale. Their suffering is real and morally significant at the first-order level.
Okay, that's a really important clarification on the ethical side. Let's dig a bit deeper into the mechanism again. How does this feel actually emerge? You mentioned consumer semantics and dual content. Can you unpack that a bit more?
Sure. Consumer semantics is the idea that the meaning or content of a mental representation isn't just inherent in the representation itself, but depends on what downstream systems do with it, how they consume it.
Right, like the piston's motion meaning something because of the rest of the engine.
Exactly. So Carruthers proposes that our mind-reading faculty, the system responsible for attributing mental states to ourselves and others, the basis for theory of mind, acts as a key consumer. When this faculty takes the raw analog output from our perceptual systems, say red patch at location X, let's call it red A, it doesn't just process it as red A, it generates what Carruthers calls dual content. It represents both the world-related content and an experience-related content. It seems ready to me.
Ah, so it adds this self-referential layer, this seems quality.
Yes. And that dual content, the first-order content, bundled with the higher-order, seems representation generated by the mind-reading consumer system, that I has phenomenal consciousness on this view. The feel is constituted by this complex representational structure being available.
Okay, so it's the brain interpreting its own input, not just as information about the world, but as an experience of the world. But doesn't this sound a bit like the old dormitive virtue problem?
Explain that one.
Well, Molière famously mocked doctors who said opium causes sleep because it has a dormitive virtue, basically, a sleep-inducing power. It just redescribes the effect without explaining it. Is saying consciousness arises from a disposition to cause HRTs just saying it's conscious because it has consciousness-making properties? Is it circular?
Right, that's a classic and very fair challenge, is just giving the phenomenon a fancy name. Carruthers argues, no, it's not circular. The explanation isn't just it causes HITs because it's disposed to. The theory specifies the mechanism, the role of the C-box, the specific function of the mind-reading system as a consumer, the generation of dual and seems content. It's detailing how that disposition is realized and what functional properties constitute the phenomenal state.
So it's like explaining why the engine moves by detailing the combustion, pistons, crankshaft, etc., not just saying it has a motive virtue.
Exactly. It's pointing to the specific functional architecture that implements the property, rather than just restating the property itself. The explanation lies in the described cognitive mechanisms.
Okay, that defense makes sense. It avoids the simple circularity. Now, what about time? Our experience feels so seamless. I see lightning, I hear thunder maybe slightly delayed, but my brain sorts it out. How does this theory handle the brain's timing differences? Neural signals travel at different speeds.
Right, the signal from your toe takes much longer to reach your brain than the signal from your eye. But if you stub your toe, you experience the sight and the feeling as pretty much simultaneous. Carruthers' view, consistent with a lot of neuroscience, is that consciousness isn't tied to the literal arrival time of signals in the cortex. That would be chaos. Instead, the brain actively represents time. It constructs a timeline. Events that are represented by the relevant brain systems as occurring at the same time are experienced as simultaneous, regardless of minor differences in neural transmission times. It's the brain's model of time that dictates the experience of time.
So consciousness reflects the brain's interpretation of timing, not the raw signal timing.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, one last fascinating wrinkle Carruthers touches on. The Freudian unconscious. If such a thing existed, a deep, inaccessible part of the mind with its own thoughts and desires, would it be phenomenally conscious according to this H-hat theory?
That's a really mind-bending question he explores, and his answer is quite possibly yes.
Really, even though it's unconscious by definition.
Well, unconscious in the Freudian sense usually means inaccessible to the main system of conscious report and control the ego. It doesn't necessarily mean lacking any form of internal processing or representation. If that Freudian unconscious system had the cognitive machinery to generate higher-order thoughts about its own first-order states, if it could make the is-seems distinction internally,
Then, according to the theory.
then its states would be phenomenally conscious, even though the main you, the ego, has no access to them.
So you could have multiple walled-off centers of phenomenal consciousness within one brain.
The theory allows for that possibility. Carruthers suggests our strong intuition against this. The feeling that I am a single unified consciousness might stem from confusing phenomenal consciousness with access consciousness, what I can access and report. Those unconscious states wouldn't be access conscious for the ego, but they could still possess their own internal phenomenal feel.
Wow. Okay, that definitely challenges our everyday assumptions about the unity of the self. So bringing this all together, this deep dive really shows how Carruthers tackles the hard problem. He argues phenomenal consciousness, while super complex and often feeling mysterious, isn't necessarily an insoluble mystery.
Right. He proposes it can be explained, maybe even reductively, through this intricate dance between first-order information held in a specific way and our brain's capacity for higher-order thought, specifically being disposed to form thoughts about its own experiences.
And the core takeaway seems to be that by making careful distinctions between properties and concepts, between different kinds of consciousness, between different brain systems and their functions, we can start to demystify that subjective feel.
Exactly. Moving it from the realm of the purely philosophical or even mystical into something that can be investigated scientifically, understood in terms of cognitive architecture and function. It's still amazing, but maybe not fundamentally inexplicable.
So thinking about this, what does it all mean for you listening? If that, what it's like to be you, isn't some special soul stuff, but is tied to how your brain is functionally disposed to represent its own states, creating that dual content of is and seems, how might that change how you reflect on your own awareness?
Does explaining it this way make consciousness feel less magical? Or maybe does understanding the incredible biological and computational complexity behind it actually deepen the wonder just in a different way?
Yeah, it poses that classic question. Does explaining the magic trick diminish the magic? Or does it shift our appreciation towards the incredible ingenuity of the magician, in this case, the natural processes of evolution and brain function? Something to definitely chew on.